Well, hola, Barcelona. Really excited to be here today, and thank you for this opportunity. This is going to be a talk on language, in fact, not a programming language because I don't actually know any. In fact, I met John last night for dinner, and he said he'd like to talk about some nerdy stuff. And I said, well, I don't know any nerdy stuff, but in fact, he wanted to talk about what I usually do. So I'm thinking like, hang on a minute. Anyway, so it's about language. It's about two little words, let's say, human error. And I've entitled the talk Life After Human Error for three main reasons. The first reason is because it kind of speaks to my life after researching human error for several years since I did a PhD. And secondly, it speaks to how things might be for us if we moved on from this idea. And thirdly, it speaks to those people who are caught up in systems accidents that have been labeled human error. So I'm a psychologist and an ergonomist, and I wondered, why, John, do you want me to come here and talk about human error? And then I kind of realized it didn't take me too long to find out that, well, your systems are highly business critical, and they're not only business critical, they are increasingly safety and security critical. And in fact, the kinds of systems that we have in aviation, also in healthcare, in rail, other safety critical industries, rely increasingly on your systems. So there's a lot, actually, that we have in common. Now, I studied human error as part of a PhD for 6 years, and I've studied it really ever since. And near the end of that PhD, after reading authors like David Wood, Sidney Dekker, Eric Hollnagel, and a few others, I came to that kind of awkward moment where I didn't really know what I was researching anymore. I didn't really know what human error was. I worked out that it's basically, it's a fairly complicated definition. It's basically someone did something that they were not supposed to do according to someone. And that's more or less it. And I can't be any more specific than that. It's impossible. If we look at some of how the media looks at human error, this has been my starting point for quite a long time because I think it speaks to us as a society. You can see in some of these tweets here that human error is estimated to be in aviation 80% of plane crashes it's involved or somehow causal, 90% of road accidents. The New Yorker had a great article there. It was great except for the title of this tweet. We have in psychology a finding since 1956 about the amount of information that people can hold in their working memory or their short-term memory. And this is called the magical number 7 plus or minus 2. It's a very, very famous research finding that says that we can hold 7 units or chunks of information in our working memory. And we have something similar in safety, I think, and it's the magical number 80% plus or minus 20%. In fact, it's always plus, because it's somewhere between 80 and 100. But most of the research seems to suggest, or at least how the media reports it, that human error is involved in 80% or more of accidents. Not only in safety-critical domains such as ours, but in all sorts of other domains, and in business-critical systems such as your own. So you can see here that there's other news stories that relate very much to your kind of business. Now, this is quite a dubious explanation for system failures. And if we look at some of the news stories, these are what we call first stories. And you can see this is quite a big deal. With the Cisco example there was from several years ago. The Google example is quite funny because in this example, Google blamed the wrong human error. So they made an error in the error that they blamed on an outside organization, which was quite embarrassing. They had to clear that up. And here was another example for the London Stock Exchange. And this is quite interesting because if you go to this line here, you'll see a certain truth that the incident was the result of human error. and it's now been closed. And that kind of throwaway line speaks to kind of how we think about system accidents, at least in the popular imagination, the popular press. Now, this is a very famous incident that you might be aware of. It involved a discrepancy between two data systems. And this was how it was reported. I don't think there's any question about it. It can only be attributable to human error. This sort of thing has happened before, and it's always been due to human error. You may be aware of the movie, but this is what I like to call the HAL 9000 explanation. So if you hear this in your organizations, then you can say that's a HAL 9000 explanation. We need to go a little bit further than that. That's not going to do. And if you've seen the movie, you'll see that the crew were not convinced at all by this explanation. And Hal, he was not completely telling the truth, although if you do a kind of 5 why analysis, which John wrote about recently, then you might get to the conclusion that actually Hal was right. So the thing about language in safety is that worlds create worlds. So words create how we think about the world. And we have many words for human error. In my discipline in psychology, we've made a whole field of error psychology where we've invented lots of other words. So this is called error taxonomy or error taxidermy, if you like, because it kind of involves finding dead errors and stuffing them and kind of inspecting them or looking at them. What you can see from this is that not all errors are equal. We'll usually be quite happy to admit we've got a terrible memory, we're not very good at typing, we make lots of errors, but nobody ever says they've got terrible judgment. Or I'm a really bad decision maker. I mean, nobody ever says that. So not all errors are created equal. And actually, the same error, let's say it's something to do with inattention or distraction, that very same error, depending on the context, could be called recklessness. It could be called professional recklessness. So there's no equivalence in how we actually use these terms. What makes the difference is the outcome and hindsight. Those two things are really what makes a difference. If you also notice here, we have lots and lots of words to describe failure. There's many, many more than this. There are hundreds. We have hardly any words, though, to describe success. We have nearly no words to describe normal, except normal, ordinary. I mean, what else do we say? But when things go wrong, we use all kinds of words to talk about how things go wrong. And this is a quote by Ludwig Wittgenstein, which gets to the point, really, that the limits of my language are the limits of my world. All I know are is what I have words for. So our language shapes the way that we think, and it shapes our possibilities for thinking. It acts as a constraint around our thinking. O'Reilly kindly hosted a blog post that I wrote. They hosted this last week. It was called "If It Weren't for the People." And I quoted this quote, another science fiction, dystopian science fiction, from the book Play a Piano by Kurt Vonnegut. And he said that if it weren't for the people, the goddamn people, said Finity, always get entangled up in the machinery. If it weren't for them, Earth would be an engineer's paradise. But you all know that that is not true. You all know that that can't be true. And you all know that it's squirrels, really. That are the source of the problem. I've read, I know about your stuff. It's these guys. Now we know where the other 20% comes from. So we have kind of a nice proportion. I like how he's in his little squirrel prison there. He's kind of, he looks a bit sad. But so what we call human error is it's problematic. It's a bit like Mystique here from X-Men. You might have seen the recent version of X-Men. In fact, Mystique was the root cause, we find out. But what we call human error is like a shape-shifting persona. It can adapt and morph into an explanation of almost any event. even though it's the same kind of everyday superheroes that keep the systems working in the first place. What we call human error is actually usually a post hoc social judgment. It's very hard actually to define in advance what an error is because it really depends on the context. The same action in a very slightly different context is not an error. It requires an inerrant standard or specification. So in order to say that something is an error, we need to know exactly what is not an error and what you must do. And that's actually very, very hard to do because the world is complex and uncertain. It points to individuals in a complex system when what we want to understand is the system itself and the work. And in doing so, it stigmatizes and scapegoats. And it can actually have quite severe effects for those people who are caught up in these accidents. It involves abilities that are vital for success, such as the ability to adjust and adapt, the ability to use expectation in order to reduce our cognitive processing demand, in order to know where to look, in order to know what to look for. Those things can also catch us out sometimes, but normally that's not the case. This was a magazine, I wrote an article for this Hindsight magazine, a Eurocontrol magazine called Human Error, the Handicap of Human Factors, Safety and Justice. So you can check that out if you like. It's also hosted on a website called Safety Differently. And these words are from a recent accident in this country, actually from last year, 2013, at Santiago de Compostela. The driver is now facing 79 counts of homicide by professional recklessness, which in another context would be called distraction. And these were his words, that we are human and this can happen to us, that this curve is inhuman. And notice how he says that this can happen to us. He was also a victim of this systems accident. So life after human error. Well, to understand life after human error, we have to go a little bit before error. And the word error comes from the Latin errar, which means to wander with no fixed course. To go back to the Proto-Indo-European root, it means to wander or to be in motion or movement. Now, this was the meaning of the word error changed in the Book of Common Prayer from 1662, where part of this prayer said that we have erred and strayed from your ways like lost sheep. So that the meaning changed quite a lot. But to look at life after human error, there's a white paper that we've published just a few months ago here at Eurocontrol, so feel free to delve into that. That discusses much more what I'm talking about just now. There's also that you can pick up these learning cards, these kind of double-sided learning cards like this, which you could maybe use in your post-mortems. So the first thing to say is that when you're looking at things that go wrong, unwanted events, you have to be careful of your mindset. That's the first thing to do. So it's to be mindful of your mindset, your reactions, and your language. In particular, to be mindful of your internal reaction, how you feel when something goes wrong. What's your first instinct? Is it to find out who did it, who screwed up? Or is it to find out what happened and how it happened? The second thing is that we don't need to focus our investigations on human error. We really want to focus on the system in the context of normal work. The interesting thing about failure very often, and you've probably observed this yourself, is that when you look into what was going on, it's quite unremarkable. That's the only remarkable thing about it. People are just doing their normal work, and things have come together in a kind of an unexpected way. The context has changed. But basically, people are doing normal work. And what people like Eric Holnagel have talked about is that failure and success come from the same source. They both come from ordinary work. And so you don't need to obsess over post-mortems. You can do pre-mortems. You can do, even better, no-mortems. You can study the system at any time and find out the same sorts of things that you would find out in a post-mortem. But you need to do this with the field experts as partners. Not as the external expert going in. This needs to be a collaborative kind of exercise. And you're doing this to study demand, to understand how people meet demand, how the system reacts to variation in demand, and how they handle pressure. Because in our systems, in service industries, the purpose is not to prevent accidents. Even in safety-critical industries, the purpose of the service is to meet demand, and so that's what we need to study. But the conditions, the system conditions vary, the resources vary, and the constraints vary. And so we need to understand how they respond to changes in demand. And resources include things like expertise, which may be variable, it may be missing. Includes things like spare parts, knowledge of certain programming languages, the availability of staff. All of these kind of things are often suboptimal, and they usually vary. And pressure is very important because a consistent finding from accident research over the years is a consistent feature is pressure, that you'll find this presence of pressure. So this really needs to be understood, how the system and how people respond to pressure. And you can do that in normal operations. And then finally, you want to understand how people respond to this. And this is really crucial, not by either doing the right thing or the wrong thing, but by adjusting and varying their performance. And in a sense, and this is something that Eric Holnagler said in his presentations, that adjusting is all that we do. If you drove here today or if you were in a taxi, the only thing that you did was constantly adjust all of the time. And every speaker will constantly adjust throughout this conference. And so performance variability is not a bad thing. It's a completely necessary thing that you need in the system to cope with varying demands and varying conditions. And also how people make trade-offs. This is another reality, that we have to make trade-offs in order to cope with variable demand, variable resources. We may be more efficient or we may be more thorough. It's very hard to be both at once, but organizations often say that you must be efficient. When something goes wrong, the message is that you should have been thorough. So we're in this constant trade-off that we have to balance. And then importantly, the thing you need to find out is how all of that makes sense to the people who are doing the work, how their work makes sense to them, how it made sense for them to do whatever they did. So to go back to life before error, to the Latin, your task is to understand the course that they wandered then, the course that they wander now, and the course that they may well wander in the future, and how that will make sense to them. And that's all from me. You've been very kind. Thank you very much.